It is a pleasure when I have the opportunity to spend even just a little bit of time with CAA Commissioner Joey D'Antonio, and today is no different despite circumstances that neither of us like. Joey, first and foremost, football aside, how are you? How's the family?
Kolby, thanks for having me. Thank you for asking. Fortunate to report everybody's doing fine. Thank you.
Very glad to hear that, sir. On Friday afternoon, you all made the announcement that the CAA Board of Directors has voted to cancel conference competition for fall sports this year. A number of sports are impacted by that decision, obviously the most high profile of them being football. So let's just start with this. How did we get here? What have the last few months looked like from your perspective?
Well, I think the lead up to getting to this point has really been both the conference office and each of the 12 football members, and then the 10 full conference members, 5 of whom overlap, really doing their own totality of the circumstances analysis as to everything that's going on their campus and in their community and within their state and local governments, of how those entities are dealing with all of the scenarios associated with COVID-19. And on the football side, keep in mind too, I think it's important to note that there are indeed 2 separate entities. There's the football conference comprised of 12 members. Of those 12 members, there are 4 Division I conferences that are represented within that group. The CAA, certainly, America East, the Big East, and the A10 all have members that play in our football conference. And then on the full member side, obviously there's 10 member institutions, and I said 5 of which overlap. So the processes were a little bit different for both, but suffice it to say that on the football side, the majority of those presidents made up of the board of directors of those 12 schools came to the conclusion that it was appropriate at this time to shut things down from a football standpoint this year, explore the option of playing in the spring, and also affirm that if institutions on their own wanted to explore playing an independent football schedule, they could do so. And then on the full member side of the 10 schools, you'll note that the release really provides an avenue and an opportunity for those 10 institutions dealing with their other fall sports to really make decisions that are best for that specific institution based on their analysis of the situation, the needs of their community, the wants of their community, what their state and local governments are telling them. And then also, how does that decision play into what's happening both on their on-campus structure as well as how that campus is interacting with their overall community. And the flexibility was given for those schools to make the decision that's most appropriate for them to make.
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there, a lot I want to get to. One question I have for you, and it could have just been my perception. I mean, obviously you have been far more involved in the decision-making process than I have been aware of what is being said behind closed doors, but it seemed like there was a general optimism across the college football landscape, even as recently as just a couple of months ago, and then that began to dissipate. Can you identify a pivot point? Does one exist where we started to go from we're optimistic to where we are now?
Well, I don't know if I can identify a definitive pivot point, but I can definitely answer the question in a way that I think is very responsive. I've been saying to our memberships since mid to early April that this is an issue of cost and complexity. And if we are going to have an opportunity to return to playing sports in the fall, I think we had all hoped, Kolby, by the time we got to this point in mid to now approaching late July, that we not only as it relates to college athletics, but I think to our personal lives, we would have seen the cost and complexity of dealing with the COVID-19 virus significantly mitigate, see both of those things be mitigated. And the unfortunate reality that we're dealing with, and I think you've seen an uptick in this may answer your pivot point question, over the last 2 to 3 weeks, is not only hasn't the cost and complexity mitigated, you can make an argument, I think, that the cost and complexity has exacerbated itself. And that's what I think brings us to the point that we're at right now. and has different conferences around the country analyzing this situation a little bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, look, you said it. You just said it. 24 to 48 hours before you guys came out with your announcement, the NCAA comes out with their updated back to sport guidelines. Now, it could be that, the CAA, America East, Patriot League, whoever, it could be that they had already intended to test to the extent that those guidelines suggested. It could be that a number of things mentioned within those guidelines they had already intended to implement or understood the reality of it being their responsibility to ensure that level of implementation. However, does the complexity of a plan like that, and you literally just alluded to it, the complexity of a plan like that where you realize we're going to have to test 75 to 100 football players, just football players, I'm not even talking about the other sports, from one week to the next. Does that effectively tie the hands of, an FCS league, a group of 5 league, just given the economic realities of the programs who are not operating with the same budget as a lot of the Power Fives are?
Well, I think it's important to note, and you've correctly pointed this out, that first of all, those are just recommendations. They're not mandates, but certainly you can appreciate the fact that when the governing body of the membership puts something like that in writing, it's somewhat hard not to say, okay, we're going to adhere to these. And you are right. It's cost and complexity, and it's going to be very difficult for any of the FCS programs and or conferences from around the country, including, I would say then, the group of 5 within FBS, to financially be able to meet those mandates. And then the other thing that I would point out to you is, there can be an argument made that maybe the Autonomy 5 can meet the costs. But I think what you're finding now is even those entities that can meet the costs are struggling with exactly how do we meet the complexities. And so you're really dealing with a double-edged sword on both fronts.
Sure. When you're meeting, you're coming up to Friday, obviously the decision is being made. How diverse were the level of concerns, not just for obviously protecting the athletes from COVID-19 staffs, et cetera, but also just keeping with the well-being of their programs and their universities, financially speaking? I mean, how many of you were on the same page? How many were kind of off on their own?
Well, certainly for reasons associated with confidentiality, I can't get into specific numbers. But what I can tell you is that each and every school, in my mind, went through a process that allowed them to get to a final decision. Certainly, there was a majority that voted that this was the proper direction for the conference to go. What actually played into each and every institution getting to that point or getting up to that line, there's so many factors that are involved. Go back to my totality of the circumstances analysis, that it's difficult for me to provide one sweeping answer to the question. I think the best way to look at it is to say that every institution did their own analysis, whether it was as a result of state and local government decisions, whether it was as it relates to what was happening on their particular campus, whether it was what was happening maybe on their particular campus with their student body in general. There could have been a variety of different factors that went into those institutions concluding, whether it's in football or in their other fall sports, that it's best right now for them to shut it down and look to see whether or not these options to play these sports in the spring would be more viable. So I wouldn't call it any one thing other than just the schools making decisions that are most appropriate for them based on the circumstances they've analyzed.
Sure. Obviously, I do not envy your position being in the position of leading such a diverse group of people, a diverse group of universities, all and with their own, very obviously important level of concern related to a number of different issues here. But I wonder how much direction, if any, has the NCAA provided in this process? I mean, what do we know about fall championships, for example, to this point? Because it would seem to me that the only way to really get a uniform response across the FCS, as an example, would be the NCAA making a decision to move fall championships to the spring, or to keep them in the fall, or to cancel them altogether. At least then we would all know what we're working towards, but it seems right now to be very ambiguous.
Well, the NCAA is in a very difficult position. I think everybody needs to realize that the NCAA is a member-driven organization. So they're not in, Mark Emmert's not in his office in some ivory tower just making decisions on his own. He doesn't have the ability to do that. And I think that as you've seen and read articles in different media reports about, well, the NCAA should do this and the NCAA should do that. I do think that people need to take a step back and understand that the NCAA is the membership. That's who the NCAA is. And right now, it is a situation where the NCAA Board of Governors, and the Board of Governors, Kolby, represents all three divisions within the NCAA structure, Division I, Division II, and Division III. And ultimately, if there's going to be a move made, it would provide some type of uniformity to the decision, similar to what we saw happen back in the spring when the spring championships were canceled and the basketball championships were canceled. That decision is going to have to be made and driven by the Board of Governors. And do I think that we could possibly be heading in that direction? Well, I mean, you're seeing the same news reports that I'm seeing day to day, and unfortunately, things aren't getting any better right now for our country as a whole. So I do think, unfortunately, that's a direction that we're headed. But those are difficult and tough decisions. And while the CAA has spoken and other conferences within the Division I structure has spoken to say, this might be the right time to make that decision, I can also respect my fellow commissioners that some of them feel as though at the present time, we just might not be there. The timeline for them might not be there right now to make that final call. And I can respect that, but I think certainly things are not trending in the right direction for all of this to happen in the fall. And what I see happening is there will be a pivot, I think, both within FCS football and within our Olympic sports to hopefully be able to explore playing those championships in the spring. But, what I'll tell you is if they don't, and we've certainly had, if it doesn't pivot, we've had some schools that have hung in there, and we're going to support those schools as best as we can support them. And if there is going to be a fall championship, either for football or for our Olympic sports, for those sports that have hung in there, we'll be prepared to support them in any way we can through that process.
Absolutely. Now, Joey, as we adjust our collective focus, obviously you adjust your focus to winter sports and specifically to basketball, what are the key metrics, points of consideration, et cetera, that you're really focused on as you try to make a call on that season? And is basketball less complex than football due to the nature of the two sports, or is it a numbers game where you're talking about, well, we have 15 basketball players and 100 football players, or is it the opposite, more travel with basketball because of the increased number of games on a road, et cetera? You tell me, what goes into making the basketball decision that makes it different than the football decision?
Well, I think first and foremost, what makes it a little bit different right now is, similar to the lead up for football, we still have a little bit of time on our side. So we don't have to make any final decisions today as it relates to basketball because we still definitely have some time to work with. We need to be poised and planning to make those decisions when they happen. And I think you correctly point out that there are still a certain number of complexities. Obviously, you're not dealing with the same number of student athletes. So certainly you'd like to think that that provides an opportunity to maybe be in a little bit more of a controlled situation. But on the flip side of that, the travel does become a little bit more difficult. Because, and when I say difficult, I'm talking again about the complexity of dealing with the virus, because you are obviously playing many more road games than you'd be playing in football.
Yep.
And, one of the things that we had talked about from a football standpoint, even as we were looking at scheduling alternatives, was how much of a situation could we get to where we were dealing with scenarios where we didn't have to worry about airplanes and we didn't have to worry potentially about hotel stays where you drive to the game, play the game, and come back. And that's going to be a little bit more challenging in basketball, I think, especially in our conference where we do have schools spread out from Boston to Charleston, South Carolina. But those are things we'll be discussing. Those are things that we'll be planning for. And I think that we all hope that at some point we're headed towards some relief to the virus, and hopefully that's in the way of a vaccine. And if and when that happens, I think you'll be ready, or we should be ready to maybe see the NCAA react a little bit more uniformly to what basketball could look like, because I think you have to realize when you look at basketball through the lens of the NCAA and specifically Division I, everybody's in the same boat. Now, TV contracts may differ. Scenarios associated with crowd size may differ, but Division I basketball is Division I basketball. It's unlike football, where we have that bifurcated situation of two separate divisions. So I'm cautiously optimistic that as we move towards both the women's and men's basketball season, that the membership as a whole may be able to develop a little bit more uniformity around, okay, this is how we're going to handle these scenarios for this year.
You've alluded to it a couple of different times now, and I've taken a very scenic route to one of the biggest questions that I've wanted to ask you. But let's make a couple of assumptions here. Let's assume that, as you've said, basketball can and will be played. And let's say, whether it starts in November or January, inconsequential, let's just say that we're playing. And let's assume that at least a few of the Autonomy 5 leagues play football this fall, provide something of a blueprint for what that looks like. How likely are we, in your estimation, as much as you could possibly say at this stage in the game, how likely are we to have CAA football played in the spring?
Well, I think it's highly likely. But I think that it's a situation where you have to take a couple of factors into consideration. And the first and most important factor doesn't really involve, in my mind, playing football. It really involves just trying to live our lives within the United States in some type of a normal capacity. So if we can get over that hurdle first and understand that there is a vaccine and or something has happened that has allowed the virus to mitigate a little bit, I think that's the first hurdle we need to overcome. After we overcome that hurdle, there are going to be logistical challenges associated with playing FCS or CAA football in the spring. But I have the utmost confidence, not only in the folks in our conference office, but also at our member institutions, that we are prepared to meet those challenges and understand what some of those difficult scenarios could look like and be able to overcome them for the well-being and good of our campuses, and more importantly for our student athletes, to give them that opportunity to be able to play a season and not have to miss an entire season because of what happened in the fall. So again, challenging, but possible. But I think those dominoes need to line up so that we can get back to some level of normalcy in our own lives first, and then be able to tackle what playing sports in the spring could look like.
Sure. All of that sounds really good to me right now. Couple of additional questions I want to get to, and then I'll let you go here. Is there a level of concern, just given departmental bandwidth, with having baseball, basketball, football all running concurrent in the spring, or we don't care about that?
Oh no, we care about it, and certainly we care about the people that are involved in those situations, and that's what I mean when I say that I have the confidence both in our members, in our conference office personnel, as well as the personnel at our institutions, that if those challenges are presented to them, while I think we all understand those will not be easy situations, that our people are pretty resilient, pretty strong, and I know they're very smart. And if there's a way to figure this out, we're going to figure it out. So I have confidence that our folks can do that. But certainly it won't be easy.
No question. You mentioned if you're, some of the programs right now that are flirting with the idea at least of competing in the fall, do so, that the CAA will support them however they can. In the event that teams like JMU, Villanova, Elon, some of the teams we've seen rumored, let's say they play as independents this fall, are they effectively eliminating themselves from a spring football season, or could they do both? What would JMU and Elon playing detached in the fall effectively harm the prospect of a spring season, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, those are situations that we're going to need to continue to analyze, I think, as the next couple of weeks play out. if there's going to be a fall season and those three institutions are going to go at it by themselves as independents and try to play a fall football season and then ultimately try to qualify as an at-large member for the FCS championship in the fall, as they go through that process and play a full season, they're not going to be able to then just pivot and play a spring season as well. So what you could ultimately see if we get to this point is you could see the CAA running not just for football, but potentially for soccer and some other sports. You could see us being involved in running 2 championships possibly. One would be a scenario that would get you into the NCAA tournament in the fall, and another could just simply be a scenario in the spring that has you playing for the spring conference championship in soccer potentially. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we don't, as you know, we don't play a championship game in football. So anybody that goes at it as an independent on their own in the fall, they'd be playing for an at-large bid for the FCS playoffs and potentially the FCS championship game. So I don't think we're going to have a problem drawing that distinction because you're really going to be playing in one season or the other.
With that, Joey, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I wish you continued health and a run of some really good fortune here as we head into the second half of this year and hopefully a much better 2021.
Well, Kolby, thanks for having me on, and right back at you. Best wishes to you and your family as well, and look forward to seeing you down the road.